You don't belong at this table." The words rolled across the ballroom with the smooth confidence of a man who had never once been questioned in his life. A few nervous laughs followed immediately after, soft at first, then louder once everyone realized Daniel Mercer was smiling. The crystal chandeliers above reflected against polished marble floors while executives in tailored suits pretended not to stare at the black woman seated near the far end of the investor table. Evelyn Brooks didn't move. She sat perfectly still beneath the golden light, one hand resting calmly on a navy folder in front of her. Around her, glasses clinked softly. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne, and somewhere near the stage, a violin quartet played low classical music that barely covered the tension building inside the room. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit and leaned back in his chair with the relaxed arrogance of a man worth nearly $4 billion. Mercer Capital banners glowed blue behind him on massive LED screens stretching nearly 20 feet high. Everything about the night screamed power, wealth, exclusivity. The annual Investor Summit was invitation only, attended by senators, hedge fund managers, tech founders, and media executives flown in from across the country. And yet somehow, Evelyn Brooks had walked in wearing a simple navy suit that looked at least 5 years old. No diamonds, no designer purse, no entourage, just confidence. That was the part Daniel couldn't stand. "Security's getting lazy these days," he said again, louder this time. More laughter followed. One executive shook his head into his wine glass, while another whispered something that made the woman beside him smirk. But Evelyn remained composed, her dark eyes fixed calmly on Daniel, like she could already see something he couldn't. The silence in her face unsettled him more than anger would have. "You lost?" Daniel asked. "Private summit." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "I know exactly where I am." The room quieted slightly. Daniel smiled again, but this time it tightened at the corners. "That confidence is impressive," he replied. "Usually people earn a seat at this table before acting like they belong here." A few people chuckled again, though weaker now. Evelyn slowly slid the navy folder across the glossy black table. The sound barely rose above the music, but somehow every eye followed it. "Then maybe you should read page 17 before midnight," she said softly. Daniel looked down at the folder, but didn't touch it. "And what exactly is this supposed to be?" "A warning." One of Daniel's senior partners leaned forward slightly. "Daniel, maybe we should—" "No," Daniel interrupted sharply, never taking his eyes off Evelyn. "I'm curious now." He stood slowly from his chair, tall and controlled, every movement polished from years of commanding rooms exactly like this one. "Tell me something," he said. "Who invited you?" Evelyn met his stare without blinking. "Someone who understands what happens next." For the first time all evening, the smile on Daniel Mercer's face flickered just slightly. Only for a second, but Evelyn noticed it. And so did everyone else. Daniel Mercer hated uncertainty. It was the one thing money could not fully control, and right now uncertainty sat directly across from him wearing a navy suit and an unreadable expression. The ballroom lights reflected softly against the black marble table as conversations around the room slowly resumed, though quieter now, more cautious. People kept glancing toward Evelyn Brooks when they thought she was not looking. She noticed every single one of them. Daniel finally picked up the folder with 2 fingers like it annoyed him to touch it. "You walk into my summit uninvited, interrupt my evening, and expect me to take this seriously?" he asked. Evelyn folded her hands calmly in front of her. "I expect you to survive what is coming." The sentence landed heavier than anyone expected. Somewhere behind them, a champagne glass touched the floor with a sharp crack. Nobody turned toward the sound. Daniel opened the folder slowly. The first few pages contained charts, financial projections, acquisition timelines, and legal references tied to Mercer Capital's newest artificial intelligence expansion project. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then, his eyes narrowed slightly. One highlighted section near the bottom of the page referenced unauthorized predictive data modeling tied to federal contracts. Another page showed internal compliance violations buried beneath shell partnerships. Daniel's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. Rain had started falling outside, soft drops streaking the glass 30 stories above the glowing streets below. 7 years ago, she said softly. Someone inside your company warned your board about the same kind of exposure. Daniel's expression hardened. I do not know what game you are playing. No, Evelyn replied. You just never knew who cleaned up the mess. A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats now. The energy inside the ballroom had changed completely. Earlier it felt like celebration. Now it felt like people sensing smoke before seeing fire. Daniel closed the folder sharply. Security. 2 men near the entrance immediately straightened. Escort Miss Brooks out of the building. Evelyn nodded once like she had expected it. She stood slowly from her chair, smoothing one hand across the sleeve of her jacket. No anger. No panic. That calmness irritated Daniel more than if she had argued. You still have 90 minutes before the investor call begins, she said quietly. After that, your problem becomes public. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think threatening me makes you powerful? Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. No. Truth does that on its own. For one brief second, Daniel felt something cold settle beneath his ribs. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Like hearing a song he had not heard in years, but somehow still remembered. The security guards approached, but Evelyn walked before either could speak. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as hundreds of eyes followed her through the ballroom. Near the exit, she paused beside a large digital display showing Mercer Capital's slogan in glowing silver letters. Building the future with trust. Evelyn stared at the sign for a moment, then looked back once toward Daniel. You might want to stop using that word, she said. Then she disappeared beyond the glass doors while thunder rolled faintly over the city outside. The ballroom never fully recovered after Evelyn Brooks walked out. The music continued. The waiters still carried silver trays through the crowd, and investors forced polite smiles into conversations about market expansion and quarterly projections. But the atmosphere had changed in a way nobody could explain aloud. Daniel Mercer felt it everywhere. In the silence that followed his jokes. In the cautious glances from board members. In the way people suddenly stopped laughing quite so quickly whenever he spoke. He returned to his seat slowly and opened the folder again. This time he read every page carefully. The rain outside intensified, tapping softly against the towering glass windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. A storm was rolling across the city, turning the streets below into rivers of red brake lights and blurred reflections. Daniel barely noticed. One highlighted paragraph near the back of the report caught his attention immediately. It referenced a predictive financial engine called Atlas 7, the internal system Mercer Capital had quietly used for years to evaluate acquisitions before competitors could react. Daniel's stomach tightened. Atlas 7 was confidential. Only 6 people inside the company even knew it existed. He flipped another page. More details. Internal timestamps. Authorization trails. Names. Whoever assembled this report had access to information buried deep inside Mercer Capital's private servers. Daniel looked up sharply toward his chief legal officer, Howard Pike, who sat 3 seats away nervously adjusting his glasses. Did you know about any of this? Daniel asked quietly. Howard hesitated too long. We have had some concerns regarding compliance exposure, he admitted carefully. Concerns? Daniel's voice lowered even further, which somehow made everyone at the table more uncomfortable. This report suggests federal fraud exposure tied to 3 acquisitions. Howard swallowed hard. The language is speculative. No, another voice interrupted softly. It is documented. Heads turned immediately. Eleanor Whitaker, the oldest member of Mercer Capital's board, slowly closed the tablet resting in her lap. Her silver hair reflected softly beneath the chandelier light, while her expression remained impossible to read. Daniel frowned slightly. You have seen this before? Eleanor studied him for a long moment before answering. Not this report, but parts of this situation feel familiar. Daniel leaned back slowly. Meaning? Eleanor folded her hands together. 7 years ago, someone warned your father about similar exposure involving the Chicago restructuring deal. The room went completely still. Daniel's jaw tightened instantly at the mention of his father. Richard Mercer had built Mercer Capital into a financial empire before dying from a stroke nearly a decade earlier. His reputation still hung over the company like a shadow nobody escaped. That situation was resolved, Daniel said flatly. Eleanor held his stare. No, it was prevented. Daniel felt something cold move through him again. What are you trying to say? Eleanor glanced briefly toward the ballroom doors where Evelyn had disappeared earlier. "The woman tonight," she said quietly. "I remember her." Daniel blinked once. "That is impossible." "No," Eleanor replied. "Your father used to call her the smartest analyst in the building." The words hit harder than Daniel expected. He looked back down at the folder in his hands, suddenly aware that his fingers had tightened against the paper. Around him, conversations across the ballroom continued in low, elegant murmurs, but at the investor table nobody moved anymore. Eleanor's eyes softened slightly as she added one final sentence. "The tragedy is not that you laughed at her tonight, Daniel." She paused. "It is that your father never would have." Daniel Mercer had built his entire life around one belief: control the room before the room controls you. But as the storm deepened over Manhattan and rain streaked down the towering glass walls of the ballroom, he could feel control slipping 1 inch at a time. Eleanor Whitaker's words still echoed in his mind like a crack running through. "Polished marble. Your father never would have." Daniel stood slowly from the investor table and loosened his tie for the first time all evening. Around him, the summit continued in careful fragments. Wealthy donors laughed too loudly. Executives pretended to focus on market forecasts displayed across giant digital screens. Somewhere near the stage, cameras flashed as reporters interviewed startup founders beside glowing Mercer Capital banners. Everything looked normal from a distance. Up close, it was beginning to fracture. Daniel grabbed the navy folder again and walked quickly toward a private hallway behind the ballroom. Howard Pike followed immediately, his polished shoes tapping nervously across the marble floor. "Daniel," he whispered urgently, "we should discuss this internally before making assumptions." Daniel pushed open the conference room doors hard enough to rattle the glass. Inside, the smaller executive room felt cold and sterile compared to the luxury outside. A 20-foot digital monitor glowed softly against dark walls, while the city skyline shimmered beyond the rain-covered windows. Daniel dropped the folder onto the table. "I want every file connected to Atlas 7 pulled immediately." Howard hesitated. That could trigger internal panic. Daniel turned sharply. "You know what triggers panic? Federal investigators walking through our front doors." Howard opened his mouth, then stopped. Silence stretched across the room. Daniel pressed both palms against the edge of the conference table, breathing slowly. He hated the feeling rising in his chest right now. Not fear. Worse, doubt. He looked back down at one of the highlighted pages inside Evelyn's report. The formatting was familiar. Painfully familiar. Short analytical summaries. Minimal wording. Precision over drama. Suddenly, a memory surfaced from years earlier. A younger analyst standing quietly near the back of a strategy meeting while older executives argued over projections. She barely spoke the entire meeting until the very end, when she calmly pointed out a hidden exposure no one else had noticed. His father had listened immediately. Daniel remembered the room going silent afterward. "Who was she?" he asked quietly. Howard blinked. "What?" "Evelyn Brooks." Howard looked away toward the rain outside. "She worked under strategic risk assessment years ago." "That is not what I asked." Howard exhaled carefully. "Your father trusted her." Daniel laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor in it. Clearly, Howard adjusted his glasses again. Richard Mercer thought she could eventually run compliance operations. Daniel's expression darkened slightly. Then why did she leave? Howard stayed silent too long again. Daniel noticed immediately. "Howard." Another pause. Then finally, quietly, "She did not exactly leave on her own." Thunder rolled across the skyline outside, low and distant. Daniel straightened slowly. "Explain that sentence very carefully." Howard swallowed hard. "There were disagreements after your father passed away. Budget cuts. Restructuring. Some people believed her recommendations slowed expansion." Daniel stared at him coldly. "Some people?" Howard did not answer directly. He did not have to. Daniel suddenly remembered his own decisions during those first aggressive years after taking control of Mercer Capital. Younger staff removed. Departments consolidated. Analysts dismissed if they questioned speed over profit. Faces blurred together now except one. A quiet black woman who never argued loudly, never played politics, but always seemed to see problems before everyone else did. Daniel looked back toward the ballroom doors where Evelyn had disappeared nearly 30 minutes earlier. For the first time all night, the silence she left behind felt louder than the crowd itself. By the time Daniel Mercer returned to the ballroom, The investor summit no longer felt like his event. It felt like a room waiting for something to explode. The storm outside had darkened the entire Manhattan skyline, and flashes of lightning occasionally lit the massive windows in pale silver. Guests continued speaking in low-polished voices, but now every conversation seemed to stop the moment Daniel walked past. He could feel it. Curiosity, suspicion, doubt. For years people looked at him with admiration or fear. Tonight they were beginning to look at him like a question. Daniel stepped toward the stage where the final investor presentation would begin in less than 20 minutes. Giant digital screens rotated through Mercer Capital branding while production staff adjusted microphones beneath the bright overhead lights. Near the front row, Eleanor Whitaker sat quietly reviewing documents on her tablet. She did not even look up when Daniel approached. "You knew she was right," Daniel said. Eleanor continued scrolling calmly. "I suspected. And you said nothing?" That finally made her glance toward him. "Would you have listened?" Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped. The silence between them answered the question better than words could. Across the ballroom, Howard Pike rushed toward the stage holding his phone tightly. His face looked pale beneath the chandelier light. "Daniel," he whispered urgently, "we have a problem." Daniel already hated the sentence before Howard finished saying it. Federal compliance servers were accessed 20 minutes ago. Daniel's jaw tightened. "By who?" Howard swallowed hard. The request authorization came from the Ethics Acquisition Division in Washington. Daniel felt the cold sensation return beneath his ribs. That division does not move this fast. Apparently tonight it does. Before Daniel could answer, the massive center screen above the ballroom suddenly flickered once. Conversations across the room stopped immediately. The Mercer Capital logo disappeared for half a second before the presentation system reset itself. Then a new name appeared briefly at the bottom corner of the display. Evelyn Brooks, Federal Ethics Acquisition Lead. Gasps rippled quietly through the ballroom. Daniel stared upward motionless. Someone in the crowd whispered, "That was her." Another voice answered softly, "Oh my God." Eleanor slowly removed her glasses. "You should have opened page 17 sooner." Daniel grabbed the folder again with stiff fingers and flipped directly to the highlighted section Evelyn warned him about earlier. This time he noticed something he had missed before. A timestamp. Midnight Eastern Authorization Review. If triggered, every hidden compliance violation tied to Atlas 7 would automatically transfer to Federal Audit Review. Daniel looked at the clock near the stage. 11:26. 34 minutes left. His pulse slowed instead of rising. That was always the dangerous moment with Daniel Mercer. The calmer he looked, the more pressure existed underneath. "Find her," he said quietly. Howard blinked. "What?" "Evelyn Brooks." Daniel's eyes never left the countdown clock near the stage. "Find her now." Howard hurried away immediately. Daniel stood alone near the glowing ballroom lights while rain hammered harder against the windows behind him. The city outside looked blurred and distant beneath the storm. For the first time in years, Daniel Mercer realized something terrifying. Evelyn Brooks had never walked into the summit hoping to embarrass him. She walked in trying to save him, and he had laughed at her in front of the entire room. The rain felt colder once Evelyn Brooks stepped outside the Mercer Grand Tower. Water rolled down the dark glass walls of the building in silver streams, while traffic crawled slowly through Midtown below, headlights glowing through the storm like distant candles. She stood beneath the overhang near the entrance for a moment, one hand wrapped around the strap of her leather bag, breathing slowly as thunder rolled somewhere over the Hudson River. Inside the ballroom 30 floors above her, investors were still drinking champagne beneath crystal chandeliers. But down here the city sounded different. Sirens in the distance, tires hissing across wet pavement, wind curling through the avenues between steel towers. Real life. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Only then did her calm expression crack, just slightly. Her fingers trembled once before she tucked them into the sleeve of her coat. She hated that part. Not the humiliation. Not the laughter. The disappointment. 7 years ago, she had believed intelligence and integrity mattered more than appearances. Richard Mercer had believed it too. But after he died, everything changed. Faster profits. Louder rooms. Men who mistook arrogance for leadership. Daniel Mercer became the perfect face for all of it. Evelyn stepped away from the building and began walking through the rain without opening her umbrella. Her heels clicked softly against the wet sidewalk while neon reflections shimmered beneath her feet in red, blue, and gold. She passed crowded restaurants glowing warm behind fogged windows. Couples laughing beneath awnings. Delivery drivers racing bicycles through puddles. Nobody recognized her. Nobody noticed the woman who might stop one of the largest financial scandals in the country before midnight. Her phone vibrated inside her bag. She looked down at the screen. 12 missed calls already. Washington. Compliance offices. Board members. She ignored all of them. Halfway down the block, she stopped beneath the light of a small corner coffee shop that was still open despite the storm. The windows glowed amber against the dark street. For a second, she considered going inside just to escape the rain. Instead, she remained where she was, staring at her reflection in the glass. Tired eyes. Damp curls. A navy suit Daniel Mercer probably dismissed the second he saw it. Evelyn laughed softly under her breath. Not because anything was funny. Because some part of her still could not believe she walked back into that world tonight. The memory of Daniel's voice echoed again inside her mind. You do not belong at this table. She should have been angry. Instead, she just felt sad for him. A black SUV suddenly slowed beside the curb nearby. Evelyn noticed immediately, but did not move. The passenger window lowered halfway. Howard Pike leaned forward from the back seat looking exhausted. Miss Brooks, he called carefully through the rain. Evelyn's expression stayed unreadable. You found me faster than I expected. Howard stepped out holding an umbrella, though the wind nearly turned it sideways. Daniel wants to speak with you. Evelyn glanced toward the towering Mercer building behind them. Its upper floors disappeared into storm clouds now. No, she said quietly. Howard hesitated. You do not understand how serious this is becoming. Evelyn finally looked directly at him. Raindrops slid slowly down the side of her face beneath the streetlight glow. I understand perfectly, she replied. That is why I came tonight in the first place. Howard lowered his voice. The board knows who you are now. Evelyn's eyes hardened slightly for the first time all evening. That should have happened years ago. The city fell quiet around them for one long suspended second except for the sound of rain striking pavement. Then Howard spoke the one sentence that finally made Evelyn pause before walking away again. Daniel Mercer, just read your original file from 7 years ago. Daniel Mercer sat alone inside the executive conference room while the storm swallowed Manhattan outside. The investor summit continued beyond the glass walls, but the applause, music, and polished conversations now sounded distant, almost unreal. The only thing directly in front of him was a thin gray personnel file with one name printed across the tab. Evelyn Brooks. He had read it 3 times already. Still, the weight of it kept changing every time he turned another page. The room smelled faintly of leather, expensive cologne, and rain carried in from the hallway whenever someone opened the door. Daniel loosened his tie completely now, something nobody at Mercer Capital had seen him do in public for years. On the first page sat Evelyn's original evaluation from 7 years earlier. Top risk analyst recommendation. Exceptional predictive accuracy. Federal ethics certification candidate. Below that was a handwritten note from Richard Mercer himself. Daniel recognized his father's sharp handwriting instantly. She sees what others miss. Keep her close to every major acquisition. Daniel stared at the sentence for a long time. Then he flipped the page and felt his chest tighten. There it was. The Chicago restructuring case. The same financial exposure Mercer Capital nearly collapsed from years ago. Attached beneath the report was Evelyn's original prevention strategy, submitted 48 hours before the crisis exploded publicly. Every recommendation had been correct. Every projection accurate down to the dollar amount. Daniel swallowed slowly. My God, he whispered under his breath. Another document slipped loose from the folder and landed softly against the table. A termination authorization form. Effective 7 years earlier. Daniel picked it up carefully. The signature at the bottom belonged to him. He remembered none of it. During those first years after inheriting Mercer Capital, he signed hundreds of restructuring documents every week without reading most of the names attached. Cut costs. Increase growth. Eliminate resistance. That was the culture he built. Now one forgotten signature sat in his hand like evidence against his own character. Howard Pike stood silently near the doorway watching him. She tried to stop this company from becoming reckless, Howard admitted quietly. But after your father died, nobody wanted caution anymore. They wanted speed. Daniel kept staring at the paper. Rain rolled slowly down the conference room windows behind him, while lightning flashed pale blue across the skyline. "So we removed the one person telling the truth," he said softly. Howard did not answer. He did not need to. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair and closed his eyes for one brief second. Suddenly he understood why Evelyn looked at him with disappointment instead of anger. She had already watched Mercer Capital become exactly what she warned them about years ago. The conference room door opened abruptly. Eleanor Whitaker entered carrying her tablet beneath one arm. "The federal investor call starts in 12 minutes, she said calmly. Daniel looked up. "Can it still be stopped?" Eleanor studied him carefully before answering. "That depends on Evelyn Brooks." Silence settled across the room again. Then Eleanor walked toward the giant digital screen mounted on the wall and tapped her tablet once. A video file appeared instantly. Security footage from earlier that evening. Daniel watched himself standing beneath the ballroom chandeliers laughing, while Evelyn sat calmly at the investor table, surrounded by executives twice as loud and half as intelligent. He watched the moment she slid the folder toward him, watched himself dismiss her in front of the room, watched the subtle sadness in her eyes before she walked away. Eleanor muted the footage and turned back toward him slowly. "Do you finally understand what happened tonight?" Daniel stared at the frozen image of Evelyn on the screen. Rainwater shimmered against the ballroom windows behind her, while everyone around her laughed. "Everyone except her," Daniel answered quietly, almost to himself. "She came here to save us." Howard found Evelyn Brooks exactly where she had been 20 minutes earlier, standing beneath the amber glow of the corner coffee shop, while rain drifted through the cold Manhattan air. Traffic lights reflected across the wet pavement in blurred streaks of red and gold, and steam rose softly from a subway vent nearby. She looked calm again now, almost untouchable beneath the storm, one hand wrapped around a paper coffee cup she had finally decided to buy. Howard stepped out of the SUV quickly, water splashing beneath his shoes. "Evelyn," he called carefully. She glanced toward him, but did not smile. "I assumed he would send you back." Howard stopped a few feet away. "Daniel wants to speak with you personally." Evelyn stared through the rain toward the towering Mercer building disappearing into low clouds. "That would be a first." Howard lowered his voice. "He knows the truth now." For the first time all evening, something flickered across Evelyn's face. Not satisfaction. Exhaustion. The kind carried by someone who spent years being ignored until disaster forced people to finally listen. She looked down into the cup, warming her hands. "Truth is strange," she said softly. "People call it confidence when it comes from the right face." Howard had no answer for that. A black sedan pulled quietly to the curb beside them moments later. Daniel Mercer stepped out into the rain without an umbrella. The city noise seemed to fade around him instantly. He looked different now, less polished, less certain. His dark hair was damp from the weather, and the sharp confidence he wore earlier in the ballroom had disappeared somewhere between the personnel files and the security footage. Evelyn watched him approach, but did not move. Daniel stopped several feet away from her beneath the coffee shop light. Rain tapped softly against the awning overhead, while headlights drifted across the street behind them. For a second, neither spoke. Daniel looked at her carefully, like he was finally seeing the full weight of who stood in front of him. "You tried to warn us 7 years ago," he said quietly. Evelyn gave a small nod. "More than once." Daniel swallowed slowly. "And I signed your termination papers." She looked at him calmly. "You signed a lot of things back then." The sentence hit harder because she said it without anger. Daniel glanced down briefly at the wet pavement before looking back at her. "I was wrong tonight." Evelyn remained silent. "No." Daniel corrected himself softly. "I was wrong long before tonight." Thunder rolled low across the skyline behind them. Somewhere nearby, a taxi horn echoed through the rain. The city kept moving while the moment between them stayed completely still. Daniel exhaled slowly. "You walked into that summit trying to protect a company that pushed you out." Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, though sadness still lived underneath them. "I walked in because thousands of people work for Mercer Capital now," she replied. "Receptionists, analysts, interns, janitors. Most of them had nothing to do with what happened to me." Daniel stared at her for a long moment. That answer somehow humbled him more than anger ever could have. "Why are you still helping us after everything?" he asked quietly. Evelyn looked past him toward the glowing Mercer Tower disappearing into rain and storm clouds above Manhattan. Because integrity is not supposed to change depending on who failed you, she said. Daniel lowered his eyes for one brief second. Then slowly, sincerely, he spoke words nobody around him had probably heard in years. I am sorry, Evelyn. She studied his face carefully beneath the amber streetlight glow, searching for arrogance, excuses, pride. She found none, only regret. Midnight arrived with rain still falling over Manhattan. Inside Mercer Tower, the investor summit had ended hours ago, but nobody had gone home. Executives remained gathered beneath dimmed ballroom lights, staring at screens filled with compliance reports, legal reviews, and federal audit notifications. The champagne glasses sat abandoned on white tablecloths now. Half-melted ice sculptures reflected pale blue light. Across the empty stage, the celebration atmosphere was gone completely. In its place stood something quieter. Humility. On the 32nd floor, Daniel Mercer stood alone near the massive windows overlooking the city. His jacket rested across the back of a chair, sleeves rolled slightly for the first time in years. Behind him, attorneys and analysts moved quickly between conference rooms carrying stacks of files and glowing tablets. But Daniel barely heard any of it. He was watching the rain. Somewhere below, yellow taxi lights drifted through the storm like moving stars. Earlier that evening, he believed power meant controlling every room he entered. Now he understood something far more difficult. Power without character eventually destroys itself. The conference room doors opened softly behind him. Evelyn Brooks stepped inside carrying a thin folder beneath one arm. She had changed nothing about herself. Same navy suit, same calm posture, same quiet presence that somehow carried more weight than the loudest voices in the building. Several executives immediately stood straighter when she entered. Not because she demanded respect, because they finally understood she deserved it all along. Evelyn placed the folder carefully on the table. These are the corrective filings, she said calmly. If submitted before sunrise, the federal review stays internal. Howard Pike looked stunned. You are still helping us. Evelyn glanced toward him. I said I would. Daniel looked at her across the room for a long moment before speaking quietly. Most people would have let this company burn tonight. Evelyn's expression softened slightly beneath the low conference room lights. Most people are tired of being invisible.